But I see just such tremendous potential impact of the church at an individual level in terms of the resiliency that an individual who has experienced trauma can receive from an engaged, compassionate, trauma-informed community. But I also think in the aggregate of what that means for society. And when we think through, the research around adverse childhood experiences, how adverse childhood experiences are correlated to literally every social ill, right? Pick substance abuse, obesity, mental health issues, whatever the case may be. When we reduce the prevalence of abuse and when we enhance resiliency and the protective factors that enable us to navigate that and cope with that in a productive way, that's a different world.
That's Robert Peters, the Director of Institutional Response at Grace, an organization that trains Protestant churches and investigates abuse. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. To understand the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandals, one must go back to the 1980s, when they began to emerge in a significant and public way through isolated cases and internal warnings from earlier surfacing. Those warnings really began in the 1960s when Father Gerald Fitzgerald, the founder of a treatment center for troubled priests, warned Vatican officials, including Pope Paul VI, that many priests should be removed from the ministry. In 1985, the National Catholic Reporter published one of the first major exposés centered on a Louisiana priest who later was sentenced to 20 years in prison for abusing children. That same year, U.S. bishops were warned by priests of a looming crisis. By 1992, the U.S. bishops adopted voluntary guidelines for handling abuse cases, and many of them would trickle into the news enough to capture the public imagination. But it was 2002 when the Boston Globe published its Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into widespread abuse and cover-ups of the Archdiocese of Boston, which had been knowingly reassigning abusive priests to new parishes, enabling abuse to continue. That it really came to the surface. I remember standing in the New York Times newsroom talking to a religion reporter who was covering the stories about what was it about the Catholic Church and perhaps the priesthood that led to such high rates of sexual abuse. Perhaps we were asking the wrong question. Maybe a better question would have been, what was it about certain environments? Religious organizations, we would come to find out over time, share several structural, cultural, and psychological characteristics that, while not inherently abusive, can create conditions ripe for abuse to occur and be concealed. These same dynamics are seen in other institutions, including boarding schools, youth sports organizations, military organizations, fraternities, sororities, and the entertainment industry. For me, one clue that this was not merely a Catholic problem was the May 2022 release of an investigation by the Southern Baptist Convention. The nearly 300-page report, conducted by an independent firm after years of quiet, mounting pressure from survivors and advocates. The key findings of the report were that there were at least 2 decades of cover-up among senior leaders at the convention's executive committee, where they ignored or dismissed or actively resisted reports of sexual abuse, stories of re-traumatized survivors, and secret lists of abusers that were never shared with churches or the public. A few days after the report was released, the convention published a 205-page list of those who had credible allegations against them. I've long wondered about things like hierarchical power structures, moral and spiritual authority, a lack of independent oversight, insular communities, forgiveness culture, and doctrinal manipulation, as well as group loyalty and a sense of identity, taboos around sexuality, and the protection of reputation. And I've wondered how those things play a role in setting the stage for abuse of all kinds. Less than a year ago, I came across a man named James Lutrell. Lutrell is an Indiana attorney who happened to be a prosecutor in the Delphi murders of two teenagers, Abby Williams and Liberty Germain. In a brief part of an interview, Lutrell mentioned the work he did for an organization called Grace, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Grace was a group that helped churches prevent and investigate allegations of abuse. It's focused on the Protestant church. I was moved by Lutrell's passion for the work and decided to reach out to Grace and connect with Robert Peters, the Director of Institutional Response at the organization. Robert has held many hats in his career, from clerking at the United States Attorney's Office in the Western District of Virginia while in law school to prosecuting cases in multiple West Virginia jurisdictions. He's developed and delivered tools for a wide variety of efforts, from the Zero Abuse Project to the National White Collar Crime Center. While as a prosecutor, he founded a group called SHIELD, a nonprofit that partners with child advocacy centers and local stakeholders to encourage the reporting of sexual abuse and online safety issues. And he's also the lead author of Child Statement and Forensic Interview Admissibility, which is a guide that was developed in partnership between the National District Attorneys Association and the National Children's Alliance. Today, we're going to discuss all of these issues, what some of the early warning signs are that there's a problem, and new ways of responding to them on an institutional level. So, Robert, I just wanted to thank you for joining to have this conversation. I remember, listening to James Lutrell, who was an attorney who had done some work with you all, talk about the kind of work you guys were doing, both in terms of looking into cases and helping. I think a way to think about it is bring justice for victims, but also bring the institutional change that we so often want in, many different areas of life when something goes wrong. And his sort of passion for it and his belief in it stuck out to me as somebody who grew up, as a Southern Baptist and in the church. I've always thought, and, I mentioned to you when we were off mic, that sort of anything in the world that can do something really beautiful. And, I think an analogy for that might be psychology. Anything that can do something really beautiful in the world can do a lot of harm. And what I think about is sort of like the psychologist in the office can have a powerful positive impact on people. But if they go home and they use those tools on their kids or their husband or their wife and they're mad, they can do a lot of damage. And so I think for my entire life, I've always sort of thought that the people who lead institutions like churches that are so important to people, and in a way, sort of, I don't want to say necessarily have power over people, but people surrender their power to them. I've always thought that it's really important to have sort of the best of us in those positions and institutions that functioned and had safeguards. And so I'm really grateful to have found out about the work you guys are doing, and just wanted to start off by letting you know how much I appreciate the fact that you're there.
Well, thank you, Jason. Thrilled to be on the show, and grateful, anytime there can be thoughtful conversations around these issues that are nuanced, and clearly you've done some homework in preparation for this discussion. I think that's a gift just to the culture. So thank you for contributing that and for your interest in this topic. And I agree. We at Grace are not sort of external to the church, lobbing Molotov cocktails, as it were. But we're a Christian organization that wants to see the church do better. I'm a devout Christian who wants to see the church do better, while being incensed and frustrated and all the other things, when the church gets it wrong, because the stakes are so high, as you noted, that can cause a great deal of harm and damage in so many ways. But by the same token, we see what can happen when the church gets it right, and when folks, are, reflecting the beauty of their faith in their communities, what that can mean to individuals and entire communities.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the reasons why, and I think just as somebody who grew up in the church, that I think organizations like yours are so important. I think some people may not realize how decentralized a chunk of Protestant churches are. They might think of the Catholic Church as one giant body, or, maybe even Protestants like the United Methodists that have this giant hierarchical structure. And they at least have the opportunity for building in safeguards and accountability. But that's not true of a lot of churches. So having a resource that you can lean on that's experienced with those things. I was kind of thinking to myself as I was doing the research for this, that understanding the culture and the language is so important. And I was thinking about from the perspective of how attorneys may struggle to enter a church environment or even work with a victim who comes from that kind of church environment. But the flip side of it's also true. Pastors probably don't know a lot about the law or justice or investigating things. And so, that was one of the things that really sort of stuck out to me and struck me. Is that something that you would say is sort of like the fair void you guys are kind of filling?
I think so. I think there's a void in a couple ways. You're touching on something that's really important to our work, and that is the need to have a multidisciplinary team handle these cases. I would certainly agree, just from cases I've followed, either with personal knowledge or just what you see out and about in the zeitgeist, that most attorneys are not equipped to handle these matters particularly well. A dirty secret for non-attorney listeners is that attorneys specialize, and we tend to be pretty good at a narrow range of things. There are, of course, some general practitioners who maybe have a bigger breadth, but generally speaking, we don't know it all.
Mhm.
Apologies to my fellow attorneys for letting that secret out of the bag.
Oh,
We don't know it all, um, and we do.
they
And we
already
do
know.
and we do make mistakes, particularly when we're outside of our area of expertise. And so, in the context of, the complexities of church culture, if you're not deeply enmeshed within that culture, you're going to make mistakes in terms of relevant language. You're not even going to flag some of the dynamics that are most significant. Some of your listeners who come from a deeper faith background may recognize things like Matthew 18 and how that
Mm,
might be significant, in an investigative context. An attorney who, that's not their background, maybe isn't going to flag that as much, might gloss over it, but it might be a critical piece. Similarly, attorneys are not necessarily trauma informed. Some of us, and I have a heart for litigation myself, and no shade to my fellow litigators, but some of us can absolutely be bulldogs, and that's great in a courtroom. That's terrible when you're seeking to intersect with someone who's experienced significant trauma. And so there are some who can do both things well, but they're rare. I also think, just from a systems perspective, attorneys can do a lot of harm depending on how conscientious they are in their intersections with churches. Is this all sort of shrouded in attorney-client privilege? In the context of an independent investigation, one, I don't know that it's possible to be independent within that sort of framework. And so it's also very difficult for anyone to serve two masters, as it were. And there can be some conflict between the ethical fiduciary requirements of an attorney in terms of
mhm,
how they are mandated to act and be in a posture towards their client versus the requirements of an independent investigation, and what that mandates in terms of equal treatment of parties, objectivity, etc. So there's a host of landmines there, I think, that we're seeking to, I think, gap fill and provide a better way for churches to grapple with some of the important issues that are necessary for cultures and communities to find healing.
I thought that was a really interesting and thoughtful point, that for attorneys, thinking of a plaintiff's attorney trying to help a victim, our society expects you to take on a fiduciary responsibility. So that's like the largest settlement for your client or something else along those lines. I've always thought, as somebody who's been on the other side of having defense attorneys, never had a plaintiff's attorney, But someone asked me, how do you find such good lawyers that you like working with? And I said the number one criteria for me in a lawyer isn't competence. That's the number two criteria. The number one criteria for me is a lawyer that shares my values. So
Yes.
that ultimately, with the outcome and with the decisions are made and the advice they give, they're doing their best to align it with my values.
Yes. I wish I could shout that perspective from the rooftops, Jason. I think that's one of the critical mistakes that churches can make as they intersect with abuse response, because attorneys are going to advise you within the realm of risk mitigation. That's literally their job. And if you're a church, that's not an irrelevant concept or principle that you should have on your radar. But if your church is not your only one, there
Mhm.
are much bigger principles more often than not, or at least there should be bigger principles in play than risk mitigation, like, WWJD. uh,
Right.
sort of,
What would Jesus do? Right,
well,
right. You know,
exactly.
you brought up that idea of Matthew 18, which Liberty University had I don't want to call it a scandal. It became a scandal after Politico wrote about it. And I want to talk to you more about this, but um, it, but one of the things that the students there really embraced was the misuse of Matthew 18, which I think is a good example of how like scripture can sometimes be manipulated
Yes.
to you know to either continue abuse or really people in positions of authority can use it. But Matthew 18 basically says, like, if your brother sins against you, go tell him it's his fault, keep it between you two alone. And like, you listen to that and I can understand where that would be applicable in a lot of spiritual situations. um but but it also sounds just like what an abuser would tell a victim.
Yeah.
This is just between us. And it was really interesting how those students made the case that there is a place for Matthew 18, but sexual abuse is not the place for it. And I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely. We, in our interpretation of Matthew 18, it's speaking of personal offenses and issues between two individuals that are not sexual assault, murder, etc. It's
Mhm.
rare that you see that verse being advocated for in a murder context, for example, or an attempted murder context. And so, with that said, there are portions of scripture that are applicable to this. I think you just made that connection between facially some of the language in Matthew 18 and how that might be utilized by an abuser. There actually are examples in scripture of abuse and of that very tactic being used. If we go to Tamar, right? King David and Tamar.
Mhm.
There's a wonderful book called Rid of My Disgrace by Grace board member, is now an Episcopal bishop, Justin Holcomb, and his wife, Lindsay Holcomb. But he analyzes this whole story of Tamar's rape. And one of the things you notice in that story, that when King David intersects with the rape victim, Tamar, in that case, he says, put it behind you, sort of, essentially forget about this. And that leads to a whole host of horrible, dire consequences, death, homicide, etc., both for, the individuals involved, but obviously at a broader, cultural level. So there are actually parallels in scripture for how to intersect with the issue of abuse. We see the metaphor of sheep and wolves, and Christ speaking very directly about that.
Mm.
We have verses in the same chapter, Matthew 18, about, if you would cause this little one to stumble, better to have a millstone hung around your neck and you'd be thrown into the depths of the ocean. But those who seek to exploit systems in order to perpetrate abuse and avoid accountability for abuse are very adept at cherry picking scripture.
Yep.
And unfortunately, all too often, the theology of some of these institutions is too anemic to counter that. And so my friend and mentor, Victor Veith, talks about how often this is a theological problem at its root.
Mm. That's kind of an interesting thought, that the power dynamics of, it's interesting. You see this in what I would call any parasocial relationship. But, when you think in church, it's a very either deep parasocial relationship, it's a true relationship, with your leaders, it's very easy when people are teaching you consistently to defer to their interpretation. And that, very often in certain environments, not every environment, because I think the ideal environment as a leader in a church or anywhere else is to welcome being questioned, welcome other perspectives, is, when challenged, often the person is the challenger of a theological idea, or the person who's asking a question about it may get pushed aside instead of in those bad cases where someone is misusing um, misusing scripture. I had mentioned one of the things that I think is really important about what you all are doing is, I think it's important to have a space of an investigation, and it's important to be able to get to the bottom of what's happening and making recommendations. But one of the things that I really admire about reading the reports that I read was that you were really looking at institutional change as being something really critical um, to, I guess, preventing it and creating better environments. And there was one thing in Grace's vision statement that really stuck out to me. It said, any church that redefines or minimizes abuse instead of stopping it is not a safe place. And I'm just curious in thinking about that as somebody who your responsibility is institutional response. What led you on this path to do this kind of work? I know your background is as a prosecutor, as I would call it, a prosecutor's prosecutor. Um, but how did you tell me about your journey?
Yes, I would say I entered law school with an in-depth knowledge of some cases, just from what was on my radar as an individual and someone who read headlines. But in law school, one of my professors was Grace founder Bosch Javidjian. And so I was a Liberty grad as well, which I'm sure we could talk about.
Hmm.
But in any event, uh,
Well, I'll tell you a dirty secret. I am a one semester attender of Liberty University.
congratulations. I'm yes,
Made it
I made
all
it
the way
through.
through.
I made it through.
Yeah, I went with a couple friends of who went with me in high school, and there are many great things about Liberty, actually.
There are.
But
Yeah.
but I when we all graduated college, I gave them a special badge. I was like, "You have the I Survived Liberty University badge. I can make it a semester. You guys made it through."
Yes. We'll have to have a longer conversation about all of that.
Right.
Definitely. So I think arriving there, and particularly in Boz's classes, it hit me that, this is a much bigger problem, both within, my faith tradition growing up, but also just in broader society. I didn't have context for how just widespread the issue of abuse was. And so that is what catalyzed the aforementioned prosecution, where I really had a heart for this issue, focused on that, just in my efforts. And that's what led ultimately to seeking ways to make more of a systemic impact.
Hmm.
After I had that experience, dealing with individual cases. So that's what catalyzed the work with, various nonprofits, the National White Collar Crime Center. That's what led to seeking to go upstream with some of the nonprofit work, initially with Shield, and then ultimately with Grace. What appealed to me is, yes, you're still doing in individual cases. And we do want to provide, the folks we work with clarity around what occurred regarding allegations, because that is important, of course, for responsible decision making. But it's more so about what moves the needle as it relates to abuse. What moves the needle in reflecting Christ's heart for the vulnerable? What moves the needle in creating safer communities? If we just come in and provide factual clarity, that's great, but that's ultimately not about changing the world. And
Mhm.
it's not really about long-term smart systems level change. And so that's what we're passionate about doing. It's much harder work, but it's the work that we're passionate about. It's the work that drew me in. And I would say that's certainly tethered to certainly, personal faith as well. It being a Christian organization, I have a passion for helping churches respond well, and it's very moving You don't see this much in public, but there are some truly wonderful ministry leaders that we work with who want to get this right.
Right.
That's not necessarily what grabs the headlines, but that's extremely moving work. On the other hand, if I'm honest, it is also about as infuriating as it gets for those who would use faith to exploit individuals, especially vulnerable individuals, which is typically the case, be that children or some other minority, gender minority, ethnic minority. Those who would utilize, one's faith to do that is just as egregious as it gets. So it's motivating, certainly, to counter those things. And then also, the inaction of others in response to that is an infuriating thing. And those are things that we, in a very meaningful way, want to drastically reduce and certainly eliminate to the extent possible.
Yeah, and that's why really sort of focusing. I've always thought, I think of it kind of like narrative, social change and narrative. I've always thought, you can tell a really compelling story about something. Let's say a crime. You can tell a very compelling story. But what really brings about change, and I think about this from the perspective of a writer, is actually using an individual story to interrogate and to do a society and do a social critique, so people have um, uh, the tools to bring about real change. I wish there was more real sociology in the world, but I was telling this to a family member of a victim of a murderer, and she said, like, the beauty of her own sister's story, because, I use that same word use, and I like caught myself as I said it. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh, this is the wrong way to phrase it. And she said, yes, because it was used to bring about good. And I just thought to myself, wow, what a gift that is to a victim, that not only am I getting some measure of justice and peace, but this horribly bad thing that happened to me may have the opportunity to bring about change that makes spaces safer for people. And, and, I just see how those things really go together in a powerful way, if that makes sense to you.
There's certainly a role for affirmation and validation. Of course, it's an objective, independent third party investigation. So, certainly we're always in the process of evaluating claims, without prejudgment. But that certainly is, in those cases where allegations are substantiated, there certainly is that critical validation and even just the process of participating in the investigation. Just someone who is trained in trauma-informed interviewing approaches,
Hmm.
someone who is a professional, has extensive years, doing this work, just sitting and without judgment and without skepticism, sitting and genuinely, actively listening to someone,
Hmm.
regardless of what the outcome is. That in and of itself is something that we often hear about being a powerful thing. And sadly, for many of these individuals, the first time and in sometimes the only time that that's happened. So there
Yeah.
certainly is a power in that. It doesn't by any means minimize what occurred or undo the trauma and the impact of those situations. But I know that's something that our team draws both encouragement from, but also a great deal of responsibility from. Is how do we intersect in a way that addresses that dimension, because it's critical to get it right.
One thing as you were talking, I was thinking about, from the perspective of some of the people who are victims or say they're victims. One of the really difficult things is, as a prosecutor, I'm sure, for anyone alleging some form of abuse, um, is, you know, and I just know this from deeply looking into these cases. It's rarely a clean narrative that, as a victim, inevitably there are going to be things in your life, if somebody does an autopsy on your life, that you don't want people to know, or embarrassing moves, or the reality. We don't really want to talk about it, but the reality is, like, we all make missteps, we all make mistakes, and I think then when you're dealing with something like sexual abuse, that's heightened because society tends to sort of like blame you. So
Mm.
I imagine that trauma-informed approach is really helpful in being able to develop a really honest investigation, because you have to create an environment where this person who hasn't had safety feels safe enough with you to not just tell you the the things, and I'm sure as a prosecutor you probably went through this too, not just the bad things that happen to them, but everything. And that's got to be really rough.
Yeah, it's incredibly challenging, and you're touching on one of my soapboxes. I still do a bit of training for law enforcement and prosecutors on the side in my extensive free time, and that's one of the big pieces, right? Because when these cases are messier, and as you pointed out, we are all humans, so there will be messiness,
Yes.
particularly where trauma is involved, particularly where a host of additional cultural, socioeconomic factors may be in play. It's going to get messy, and so all too often, my fellow prosecutors and fellow law enforcement officers may run from a case that's hard or a case that's difficult. And so, is the bane of my existence as a prosecutor, but it still is an issue, certainly in the law enforcement setting, because yeah, these aren't cookie cutter clean, what you see on TV. This is real life. It's messy, and it comes with a lot of difficult things. And you're absolutely right. Part of our process, or what we strive to have be part of that process, is a place where we are cultivating that safe space where we can just discuss the truth, and the truth is sometimes messy, and that's okay.
Right, right. And I completely agree with that. You all have been a part of a lot of high profile investigations. Some of them have become, some of the reports or information become publicly available. I read about some of the work you guys did at Bob Jones University. And, when they had actually asked you all, the way I read it, they had asked you all to come in and explore the way that they responded to sexual abuse. I think of places like New Tribes Missionary Boarding School, which is in Africa, Senegal, right? Um, where you guys went, Covenant Life Church and Sovereign Grace Ministries, which are just up the street from me, and were just up the street from me in Maryland. And I know people who went there. And one of the things that really struck me about your reports, and the Bob Jones one really stuck out to me, was that, you know, you all basically said to the people who hired you, you consistently blame the victims, you discourage the police from being involved, and you use theology to silence survivors. And I was reading another investigation you guys did at Vineyard Church in Duluth in Minnesota, where the son of the pastor, who was, a member of the youth group and then also served as the youth pastor, and he was eventually charged with, I think, sexually assaulting 5 girls in the youth group. But you guys held back zero when it came to the parents' complicity to in terms of the parents' complicity in terms of abuse. And it really stuck out to me that in the face of the people paying your bills, um you were so clear and direct with the truth. Could you tell me a little bit about that piece of it? How people come to hire you, what kind of commitment you expect for them? But you must have some expectations that you set out for them that go along the lines of, look, if you hire us, tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few dynamics that play into that reality. As you can imagine, that dynamic is not the natural order of things. And
No.
so there's some specific things that have to be in place in order for us to be truth tellers, including to the people that are paying the bills. And so I think there's a few pieces that go into that. One of those, I'd be remiss if I didn't note just the history of it. Boz Tchividjian founding the organization, leading it up to the year 2020. Our executive director, Pete Singer, who just passed away actually almost 2 months ago
Hmm.
to the date of this recording. And so there's a leadership legacy that's resulted in a cultural legacy where at Grace, we don't traffic in fear. We don't traffic in coercion. Some people understand that quite well. Some of our ministries that we work with understand that quite well. Some of them don't, and explore just how much attempts in fear manipulation and coercion could influence us. And spoiler alert, it doesn't. It just doesn't. It doesn't have currency with us. And I think the cultural piece and the leadership piece are important to that. But to your point, there are systems that have to be in place to facilitate that. So early on, our engagements typically start out as free consultations with ministries, reaching out to us, often but not always in response to a crisis of some sort. And so we're able to just have an open dialogue about, what specific questions they're wrestling with, what are the relevant dynamics in play, what our recommendations are. Sometimes our recommendation is to conduct an independent investigation. Sometimes it's not. It really depends on unique facts and circumstances. There may be other approaches that are better for a particular situation. But once it gets into an investigative context, one of the feedback we often get, because of course other attorneys representing ministries review our contracts as we're in that engagement process. I think the most used word in that process is unique. The contracts are unique. They're uniquely structured. They're unique in terms of the roles and responsibilities. And that's true. That's true. And that's accurate, on the part of those attorneys. And so it very much is an educational process. I think we can always, learn to be better at it, but educating churches about why that is. One phrase that I often use in that onboarding process is we're flexible in logistics. So if it's a church that is smaller, these investigations are not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. These investigations are not cheap. And so we try to be flexible, to see how we can meet the needs, of a particular organization. We're flexible in logistics, but we're inflexible in principles. And so contractually, independence and objectivity are baked into the structure. So for some concrete examples, grace and only grace determines what the witness count is. Grace and only grace determines what questions we ask the witnesses, how we reach out to witnesses, who those witnesses even are, what any sort of communications with the witnesses are like. There's some exceptions, like if there's some sort of safety issue, imminent safety issue, the church organization needs to be aware of. If there's, mandatory reporting implications, of course. But baked into it is, Grace very much has the independence to conduct the investigation in accordance with its policies and practices. And we will update, the organization typically on at least a monthly basis and more often as crises or questions arise. But ultimately, Grace is in the driver's seat for where that investigation goes. Additionally, it's not just the investigative process, it's also the report writing process. We do have quality control measures in place where feedback is received, both from reporting victims as well as from leadership before that report is ultimately disseminated. But Grace and only Grace has editorial control over that. And there's an in-house multidisciplinary team and a peer review process that we implement that does not involve, the ministry that is paying for that investigation. So that's a really big deal. And it's a really big deal. And we mean it when we commend institutions for engaging with that process, because it's a big commitment and it's inherently a vulnerable position. But our belief, and I think supported by our experience, is that ultimately it can lead to some really important and positive things, both for individuals and for cultures.
One of the things I was thinking about, sort of like the business analog, might be, and it can play out lots of different ways. Like an organization's executives could order an investigation like this. The board could do it without the chief executive knowing or having any say in it, or the general counsel of an organization could do it. But usually, if you're a big organization, you hire former Attorney General Loretta Lynch's firm, or, former FBI Director Louis Freeh. They come in, they do a deep investigation, they tell you what happened, then they give you recommendations, usually for improvements to processes and procedures. And that's somewhat, a standard approach. But and they can explore things like your, the structure of your organization, the hierarchical structure, the things that sort of get in the way that can cause a problem. But I sort of think about the work you do. And there are other issues that are play that are both very connected to the identities of these organizations and the people who are involved in these things, but probably crucial to long-term change. And I think of things like moral and spiritual authority, the nature of many churches where they don't have direct oversight by another body. Things like we were talking about, like with Matthew 18, there's also this notion of the culture of forgiveness in churches. And we talked a little bit before about manipulating doctrine. Do you go in and also make these sort of deeper spiritual and theological recommendations as well?
Yes, and that's often some of the most important aspects of the report. Uh, for lack of a less common cliche, it's the system stupid, not to bring back the 90s.
So
But
true.
very often those pieces, those cultural pieces are animating everything else. To borrow, from a criminal justice concept, it's fruit of the poisonous tree. And so, which I suppose that in turn borrowed from a theological context. But
Yeah.
in any event,
Right. Yes.
but in
All
any
that is comes back around.
yes, yes. So it's very much the issue, right? The dynamic of a theology where the belief is that women cannot be in leadership. Grace doesn't have its own theology per se, but we do note how there are risks to any theology. That's not to suggest that theology is correct or inaccurate. We don't impose that on the churches we work with. We try to work within a specific church's cultural framework. But any theology, correct or incorrect, carries risks. And so if your theology is, to take a very literal interpretation of some of the words of Paul, talking about how women should be silent in church, etc., which I think, may lack a bit of nuance if we look elsewhere, but we won't go down that rabbit hole.
It's funny, but I am going to divert you here slightly.
Let's go down that rabbit hole. Yes.
This is literally the battle that I had in church that actually got me to pull away from the church or return. And, it's funny because it ties into the kind of abuse that we talk about. And, for me, leaving the church, it had been at the center of my life, and it severed my sense of belonging in a way that it took decades for me to recognize and start the process of healing. But it probably the penultimate example of this is one day in my Sunday school, my teacher, wonderful woman, she says to us, the women should be silent. They shouldn't teach men. And I asked the question, I was like, well, so we're like 13 and 14, and that's sort of like the age of becoming a man during the biblical times. So why can you teach us? And I was just generally asking the question. She was dumbfounded. And she was like, that's a really good question, Jason. I'm going to go find out. And, I talked to our youth pastor about it in between, and he was like, it's the doctrine of our church. We don't have women who are in what they called minister roles. They have pastor roles and minister roles. We don't have women in minister roles, but for him personally, theologically, he didn't see an issue with it. So the next week, our Sunday school director, mildly controlling guy, comes in and he gives an explanation. And I say to him, like, this does not make sense to me. And his response is to quote scripture about how the devil divides us. And it just broke my heart in that moment that he was calling me the devil for asking that question. And so I think my whole life since then, I've been very sensitive to both the notion of, using scripture to manipulate, but also that idea that there are these costs, like you're talking about, to any theological framework. And it doesn't just have to be that example. And I wish he had said in that moment that this is our church's policy, and I don't exactly know why, right? That would have been a much better answer than calling me the devil, I think. Um, um, but, uh, but, um, but I do think, um, that for me, being able to, and I think that's just a beautiful way of looking at it, being able to look at the risks associated with anything. Like we have a building and there are risks associated with that, right? We have employees and there are risks associated with that, right?
Correct.
We have an IT security guy, right? It's not because we don't trust our employees, but yeah. Um, and so yeah, so that struck a chord with me, I guess.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's and we see that across the across the breadth of denominations. There are different risk factors present in different settings, and that's a good example. I think one element there too is when you don't have vulnerable populations represented in a position of decision making. That's sort of the risk factor we often see with regards to that example. I think of a case where we were dealing with an all male leadership team, which is certainly common, but they came to the independent conclusion that our process would be greatly enhanced if there were women here. um, and and that was correct. That was a correct statement. And so when you don't have those individuals, when you don't have individuals who could be affected by decision making represented on those bodies, that's a tremendous risk factor. You struck your story also jumped out to me because it illustrates, one of the things that we often find ourselves investigating, and this is something that I think, we're one of a few firms that do investigate this aspect, and it's not typically doesn't have a civil corollary, or certainly not a criminal corollary, but this concept of spiritual abuse,
Mm.
which is a form of emotional abuse. So it's essentially emotional abuse with some sort of spiritual dimension. It's where we're seeing the tools of religion, Bible verses, whatever the case may be. I'm using Christian examples, though it has its corollaries in other faith backgrounds, of course, to control and to domineer. And it's generally a pattern, not a specific event, although there can be a pattern that's isolated events towards individual people. So I just think you just gave, a tragic example, and I'm not, formally opining that it constitutes, spiritual abuse, but I am saying, that tactic of you're raising a concern, so you are the evil one, right? That is
Mhm.
a tool of religion, and it's utilized to control,
Right.
violence in your situation. And so that's something we unfortunately see so often in cultures that need help.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the reason, going back to that point about, attorneys may have a hard time entering a church environment because they don't understand the culture, that sometimes church leadership trying to respond to some of these issues, I I've seen moments where very well-meaning people at churches are really concerned about the spiritual well-being of both people, let's say a victim and a perpetrator, and they're
Yes.
really trying to balance that out, but I feel like not every cover up that happens is because someone has intentions of, hiding it for the institution. They're really trying to do the best for both people because they don't have the experience in this, they don't know how to navigate that.
And
And
they didn't teach it in seminary.
right.
They don't have any playbook for how to navigate it, and that's a much broader issue in terms of education reform, because so many of these are put in an incredibly unfair position, lacking that context to intersect. And you're right that sometimes some of the things that cause grievous injury are not coming from malintent; they're coming from genuine ignorance. I think of a situation where a pastor was intersecting in a public context with a group of victims, and it was sort of a panel setting, and he caused a great deal of harm by going off script from what the panel was about and lecturing on the importance of forgiveness, to go back to our earlier topic, and how when you forgive someone it sets two people free, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not turning away from all doctrines on forgiveness by any stretch of the imagination, but the reality is the victims in that room, had endured trauma that he had no context for whatsoever. And so he wasn't seeking to inflict harm, but he did cause harm, because the nature of those, I mean, there were incest survivors in that room. There were individuals that had suffered unimaginable things that he wasn't aware of, but still, forgiveness is a long, long process. And there are therapeutic aspects to that. And you don't, click your heels, snap your fingers, and, ta-da, everything's forgiven. And so I think that's an area where that lack of expertise, combined with ignorance, lack of preparation, it was motivated by a good place, but it certainly caused harm. And I think that's one example of the dynamic you're mentioning.
Right.
Sometimes that's where a lot of this harm is coming from, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that shows up in a lot of different contexts where people are trying to do well, like do something good. I think of that idea of forgiveness, and I think the framework for me is that forgiveness is the optional exhaust of justice. It's really hard to get to the point of forgiveness if there isn't justice. And I believe that there is a lot of healing in justice, but it is not a requirement or an expectation of another person to do for you. It's their choice for whether it's better for them. So it's truly the exhaust of it as opposed to a requirement. I wanted to take you back to liberty. You know, I know you mentioned that Grace was founded by Boz, son of Billy Graham, the famous preacher. And, he was at a teaching position at the law school at Liberty. And when Politico started reporting on some of the issues around rape allegations at Liberty, where people were being discouraged from going to the police and reporting them. People were being disciplined for things like having premarital sex when they were assaulted. It was like a bunch of stuff along those lines. One of the things as I was looking into this, I was thinking they have Boz sitting in their law school during these times, and what a missed opportunity for them. And I assume a place like Liberty hires a man like that for a reason, for his expertise, for his knowledge. And it just really sort of made me step back and say, what is it? And, not Liberty specific per se, but what is it that causes an institution to recognize the value of something like this, but yet still reject it at its core? It's almost like a negative immune response to the very thing that they've already identified as valuable.
Yes, there's a lot there to unpack, certainly. I agree that it was a missed opportunity. And I think there were other voices as well that could have been utilized. I think of Professor Karen Swallow Pryor, who we recently had on the Grace podcast that is not yet launched, but will soon.
Great.
And, another individual who I would say, faithful voice, educated on pertinent dynamics. And those voices, for whatever reason, were not heeded. I think there's some systems implications there, of course, to why that might be the case. But yeah, certainly a missed opportunity. And I think that, so I think that also speaks to, I think Boz saw a lot of what was coming down the pipeline with Protestantism before the headlines caught up. And it's interesting on a variety of levels. I don't know that I'm answering your question.
Right. No, I think you are. One of the things that I've always wondered about in situations like that, when you're in the position of whether you're the CEO or a bunch of pastors or your teachers or whatever it is, when you're paid to pass on your quote unquote wisdom, or in this case, God's wisdom, along with yours with other people, I think it can make it a little bit harder to do sort of like metacognition and mentalization and really be self-aware about your own flaws, because you're constantly on the stage, even when you're literally not on the stage, as the man or the woman with the answer. And that creates a real blind spot for people. And I would imagine for spiritual leaders, even more than business leaders, because what is expected of you, or what you may perceive is expected of you, to always have the answers, to always have the wisest choice, sometimes to not back down from decisions that you made, can create real traps in terms of making mistakes in these areas.
Yes, it does. And I think that's something that, I gave a conservative risk factor earlier. So I'll tie what you just said to a risk factor that I at least associate more with, liberal entities. If, those that we partner with from a more liberal spectrum may think that they have it all together because they're
Yes.
not like those conservatives and they're, archaic, what, blah, blah, blah. Insert whatever the issue is. And the reality is that, these issues of power, issues of treating people well and with dignity, those are relevant to any organization in any faith tradition. And so, yeah, if we think we have it all together, or if we think we need to present that we have it all together, it's extremely dangerous. And I think some folks certainly make that conflation where, I have to act like I have it all together. I have to act like we didn't make any mistakes, whether that's informed by, advice of counsel, or whether that's informed by, a need to do that impression management. One of my colleagues,
Or a general lack of humility on both extremes, I think.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. There's one of the individuals who works at Grace, Dr. Wade Mullen, who actually is a quasi-editor-in-chief role within our organization. He wrote his dissertation on the impression management strategies that are used by evangelical organizations, and I think that goes to exactly what you were just saying.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of psychological phenomenon that, if you look at the distribution psychologically among humans, like about half of us want to do some measure of impression management, half of us don't care. There's some sort of subscales and categories. But, it's very interesting when you look at the research on institutions, they lean much more toward impression management. We're diligent, we're precise, we're perfectionistic. We listen to what people say, we follow the rules, we blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that's confined to people who are on a traditional side versus a more progressive side. And I also think there's this fear that it'll all fall apart if people find out I made a really bad mistake. But good luck in avoiding that, because I think that's sort of like the human condition, right?
It is.
We're gonna hurt people. We're gonna make mistakes. One of the things that I was kind of wondering about, when you sort of step back and think of sort of the big picture, and you sort of think about what you sort of hope and want for the church more broadly, and for the flock, for the congregants within the church and the societies that they touch too, what would a world be like 20 years from now if you all had truly made the progress that you want to make?
That's a great question. I think we could recognize that, if multiverse theory is true, which I don't think it is, but there's certainly, I think of an alternate universe where, some of the things Boz in particular was saying 10, 15 years ago were heated. He talked about, he talked about those in the Protestant church that were sort of pointing a finger at Catholic colleagues as the various priest scandals unfolded, while not addressing some extremely significant risk factors and indeed cover-ups within their own ranks. If there had been that reckoning back then, 10, 15 years ago, what the world could look like, and we would be halfway there. And not to segue too long, but even at that time, Boz, I recall, pointed to statistics on known claims against the Catholic Church versus known insurance claims against Protestant churches. And even then, 10 plus years ago, there were more claims annually against Protestant churches than Catholic churches,
I would have never
even with
guessed that. I would
even
have
with the
never.
hierarchy, even with the larger plaintiffs target, the press, all of that. Even then, there were still significantly more claims, just on an annual basis.
Wow.
So I say all that to say, Boz saw where this was going, but all of us should have.
Right.
And there was enough information. There are advocates that have been, trying to raise the alarm for a very, very long time. But in any event, to get back to the positive question, I think of what the church could look like in the future. Even if you as a listener are not a person of faith, there's significant secular literature, academic research around the resiliency factors surrounding spirituality and spiritual practices more broadly. And so if the church is engaged on this issue, that has spectacular implications for the resiliency of church congregants and others who are affiliated with churches from a resiliency perspective. And this world needs resilience, to say the least. We all need heavy doses of it. But I think of some studies that have come out of the Dallas area and elsewhere of individuals who described spirituality as a critical aspect of their resilience, of care, of finding meaning, of finding purpose, of finding community, and how that's linked to protective factors, particularly when we talk about adverse childhood experiences and what those protective factors are. Individual support, communal support. An engaged, informed, compassionate church can have a spectacular impact on the trajectory of our society, because it can impact, from a prevention perspective, prevalence of abuse writ large, but it can also deeply impact how abuse is experienced, how abuse is processed in positive ways that can enhance resiliency for those individuals if it is engaged, informed, and there's a ton of work to be done in that. So when you ask the question of what it looks like, what the church of the future looks like, my hope is certainly for the church, but my hope is also much broader than that in terms of what an engaged church means for society. It means a flexible organization that can gap fill. And as we know, and as we see, societal gaps are increasing. Need for social supports and social gaps are increasing. But I see just such tremendous potential impact of the church at an individual level in terms of the resiliency that an individual who has experienced trauma can receive from an engaged, compassionate, trauma-informed community. But I also think in the aggregate of what that means for society. And when we think through, the research around adverse childhood experiences, how adverse childhood experiences are correlated to literally every social ill, right? Pick substance abuse, obesity, mental health issues, whatever the case may be. When we reduce the prevalence of abuse and when we enhance resiliency and the protective factors that enable us to navigate that and cope with that in a productive way, that's a different world. It's a kinder world. It's a more informed world, and it's a world I'd love to live in.
Thanks, Robert. I really do appreciate it. This has really been informative for me, and I am looking forward to you guys starting your podcast and want to hear more about that, and certainly let people know when that comes down the pike. But I really appreciate what you guys are bringing to the table and to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Jason, and appreciate all of the thoughtful preparation. If your listeners don't know behind the scenes, there clearly was a tremendous amount of thought and insight that Jason brought to this. So grateful for that, just as a guest, and for your listeners, thank you for your careful work here, and also just raising a light on this issue. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks for joining us for this discussion. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast, We'll see you all again in a few days.